Picture this. It is 3:17 inches the morning on a fog-covered rural road in Mexico. A single armored truck cuts through the absolute darkness. Inside that truck is $6.2 million in cartel cash, heading straight to a money laundering operation across the border. In exactly 14 minutes, the most perfect heist in the history of the cartel will be executed. $6.2 million will simply vanish into thin air. 4 innocent men will be framed, hunted down, and brutally murdered for a crime they did not commit. But here is the most chilling part of this entire story. The ruthless cartel leaders, men who command armies of assassins and control entire cities, will never know that they were robbed by their own janitor. They will torture the wrong people, destroy innocent families, and never once suspect that the quiet man who mopped the blood off their floors was the exact same mastermind who stole their millions. This is not just a robbery, this is a total humiliation of a massive criminal empire. This is the true story of Luis Alvarez, a man who earned $11 a day, and how he hacked, manipulated, and dismantled a ruthless syndicate from the inside out. Let me take you back to where this blood-soaked chess match truly began. 2 years before that foggy night, Luis Alvarez was a ghost, literally nobody. At 34 years old, with only a 6th grade education, he was the kind of person society had trained itself not to see. He worked as a janitor for the Hermanos Negros cartel. His job was to clean the main headquarters, a place where millions of dollars changed hands every single week. For 18 months, Luis mopped the floors, emptied the trash cans, scrubbed the toilets, and fixed broken air conditioning units. To the heavily armed cartel members walking those halls, Luis was nothing more than furniture. He was invisible. He was forgettable. But here is the fatal flaw in human nature. Furniture has eyes, and furniture has ears. During his first year on the job, Luis heard absolutely everything. While he was wiping down the glass tables in the boss's office, he would overhear phone conversations about massive money transfers. While he was fixing the ventilation shafts, he would listen to top-secret logistics meetings. While he was emptying the overflowing ashtrays, he absorbed incredibly sensitive details about smuggling routes, delivery schedules, and security procedures. The conversation that fundamentally changed his life happened on a random Tuesday in October. While he was quietly cleaning the large windows in the main conference room, Luis heard the operations manager explaining a recurring financial problem. Their Tuesday night cash runs through the Campo Nuevo route were completely unguarded. It was a clean operation with minimal security, but it came with a deadly catch. The drivers kept disappearing. Some were killed by rival gangs, others were executed due to internal paranoia, and a few simply vanished into the night with the cash. The manager laughed as he explained their brutal solution to the bosses. They would just pay the drivers $500 per run, but fully expect them to be dead within 3 trips. It was mathematically cheaper than hiring a full security detail. Luis continued wiping the glass, his expression never changing, his hands moving in slow, rhythmic circles. But inside his head, a terrifying calculation had just begun. $6 million every Tuesday, minimal security, dead drivers. What if the next driver simply disappeared in a slightly different way? But at this point, Luis was not a criminal mastermind. He was just a guy with a mop who had never stolen anything larger than a box of paper clips. How could someone like him possibly rob one of the most violent cartels in the world? The answer came 8 months later, when pure fate handed him the master key to the entire kingdom. In June of the following year, the cartel was conducting a critical system upgrade. Suddenly, their main technical specialist called in sick. The surveillance equipment was completely malfunctioning. The network was down, and the bosses were panicking. They needed someone, anyone, who understood basic electronics to fix it immediately. One of the guards pointed his gun at Luis. The janitor had fixed their break room Wi-Fi before, hadn't he? Luis nodded quietly. He had taught himself basic computer repair by watching YouTube videos during his spare time in his cramped apartment, practicing on discarded electronic junk. It was just a hobby to pass the lonely nights. But as the guards escorted him into the heavily fortified server room, Luis realized he had just been handed something far more valuable than a bag of cash. He had been handed access. The cartel's entire digital infrastructure ran through this single central server. The security cameras, the GPS tracking systems on the transport trucks, the encrypted communication logs, the financial records, absolutely everything was connected right here. And now, the invisible janitor had full administrative access to all of it. For the next 6 months, Luis intentionally made himself the cartel's unofficial IT support guy. Every time there was a technical problem, every time a camera malfunctioned, every time a network went down, they called the janitor. He was reliable, he was quiet, and he was completely ignored. What the bosses did not know was that Luis was meticulously documenting everything. He memorized every single admin password. He mapped out every system vulnerability. He cataloged every piece of digital evidence that flowed through their hidden network. He learned about the massive money pickup schedules 3 whole weeks in advance. He knew exactly which routes had heavily armed security escorts, and which routes were left completely vulnerable. He could access the real-time GPS data from every single vehicle in their massive fleet. But most importantly, he learned exactly how to manipulate their surveillance system. He learned how to loop the live camera feeds to show empty rooms. He learned how to insert false timestamps into the security logs. He learned how to make the digital evidence show whatever he wanted it to show. Luis Alvarez was no longer just a poor janitor scrubbing toilets. He had transformed into a digital ghost, moving invisibly through their electronic nervous system, learning their darkest secrets, and preparing for a massive strike that they could never, ever see coming. But having knowledge without taking action is completely worthless. Luis needed more than just access. He needed a flawless execution plan, and that plan began taking its dark shape in his small, depressing apartment, under the flickering light of a single desk lamp. What followed were 18 months of meticulous, obsessive preparation that would have deeply impressed elite military strategists and absolutely terrified criminal psychiatrists. The board was set, and the pawn was about to become the king. If you could have somehow seen Luis Alvarez's tiny apartment in December of that year, you would have thought you had just walked into the violently obsessed mind of a serial killer, not a janitor planning a robbery. Every single wall was entirely covered with stolen maps, security schedules, blurry photographs of cartel members, and complex flowcharts. Thin red string violently connected specific dates to remote locations, delivery routes to heavily armed personnel, and predictable patterns to deadly opportunities. It was the workspace of a brilliant detective, hunting down the biggest score of a lifetime. But Luis was not crazy. He was methodically cold. The brutal turning point, the moment that forged him into a monster, came late one night while he was cleaning a massive concrete loading bay. A heavily filled metal bucket violently slipped from a high ledge above him. 40 pounds of solid metal and dirty water smashed down with terrifying force, directly across his right hand. The sudden pain was absolute, sharp, numbing, and horribly hot. The very next morning, the cartel bosses carelessly sent him to a cheap, filthy, private clinic on the absolute edge of town. They did not want him missing any shifts to recover. So, he just sat there in a cheap plastic chair, agonizingly cradling his mangled hand, waiting endlessly for a doctor who was already 40 minutes late. The old television in the waiting lobby was flickering brightly, mounted high up on a dirty wall. It was showing a documentary rerun, one of those grainy true crime specials, narrated in a low, serious voice. It was covering the legendary 1978 Lufthansa heist at JFK Airport, where over $5 million in pure cash was stolen and completely vanished forever. Luis wasn't really paying close attention at first, staring blankly ahead. But then, the low voice on the TV delivered a single line that changed everything. In every truly great heist, the real genius isn't the one who actually steals the heavy bags of money. The real genius is the one smart enough to make sure someone else takes the hard fall. Luis slowly looked up, his eyes widening. The documentary carefully explained how the real criminal masterminds never got caught by the authorities. They always let the lowly foot soldiers rot away in maximum security prisons, or violently disappear into shallow graves. They didn't just steal the cash, they effectively erased themselves from the entire story. That night, Luis could not sleep. He furiously replayed that exact phrase over and over in his dark mind. Suddenly, it was no longer just about taking the $6 million. It was entirely about the violent aftermath of the money, about exactly who the cartel would blame when the massive cash pile inevitably vanished. By dawn, he had meticulously crafted a brand new plan, one infinitely more dangerous and brilliantly evil than anything he had even vaguely imagined before. He slowly opened a perfectly clean page in his stolen notebook and carefully wrote down 2 terrifying words in red ink. Scapegoat redirection. The massive robbery would definitely happen, but some other poor soul would pay the ultimate bloody price for it. The next few weeks became an obsessive, terrifying hunt. He quietly stole top-secret personnel files, one by one, and spread them all out on his tiny bed. He furiously took detailed notes in a stolen financial ledger, coldly assigning threat scores, deeply analyzing psychological traits, and calculating personal risks. He wasn't just looking for random character flaws, he was ruthlessly looking for convincing stories. Stories that would successfully make completely innocent men look undeniably guilty to a paranoid cartel boss. Carlos Vega showed up on his terrifying radar completely by accident one rainy night. While taking out the massive bags of trash behind the headquarters building, Luis sharply noticed a very familiar car parked across the dark street. Inside, Carlos was sitting in the passenger seat, aggressively kissing a woman. She was young, she was pretty, and she was definitely not his wife. They were kissing fast, intensely nervous. Luis lingered in the dark shadows, just a second longer than he probably should have. Not because he was genuinely shocked, but because something about the frantic scene didn't add up correctly. He didn't know who she was, or why Carlos was risking his life with her, but he instantly latched on to that dark secret. Sometimes, all it takes to completely break a strong man is finding just one tiny crack. Luis had just found a massive one. Now, he just had to coldly follow it. Next up was Mario Guerrero. Luis had repeatedly seen him lurking near the designated smoking area behind the massive warehouse. Mario was always nervously pacing back and forth, always incredibly jittery, looking exactly like a desperate man, frantically trying to outrun his own dark thoughts. One night, while emptying the bins, Luis overheard Mario talking on the phone. He kept repeating the same line over and over again. "The money's coming, I swear to God. Just give me a few more days, please." His desperate voice completely cracked halfway through the pleading sentence. Luis didn't know exactly who was threateningly on the other end, or what the massive debt was truly about. But he absolutely didn't need to know the fine details. Pure fear like that had a very distinct shape, and once you saw it, you simply couldn't unsee it. Luis made a very quiet mental note. Not a primary target yet, but absolutely worth watching closely. Then there was Fernando Silva. Luis kept repeatedly running into him in the strangest places. Dark hallways, active loading zones, quiet break rooms. And every single time, Fernando had incredibly annoying questions. Too many damn questions. Why exactly are we changing the entire shift schedule today? Who the hell signed off on this brand new transport route? Where exactly is all this massive cash secretly going tonight? He wasn't aggressively loud, just incredibly persistent. Luis once overheard him in the damp locker room, aggressively grilling a senior supervisor for 10 straight minutes about a slightly missing shipment report. That very night, Luis coldly wrote Fernando's name down in his little notebook and carefully circled it twice in thick red ink. Right next to it, he sharply scribbled, "Too many questions." Then there was Ricardo Morales. He was simply too perfect. Always incredibly early, always totally quiet, always strictly followed every single rule. Among a massive crew full of loud screw-ups, violent men who drank way too much, gambled way too often, and always skipped steps just to get home a little faster, Ricardo stood out like a sore thumb. He didn't loudly party. He didn't slack off on his duties. He did absolutely everything perfectly by the book. And that, in a brutally corrupt place like this cartel, was its own very special kind of incredibly suspicious behavior. Luis acutely noticed it, quickly wrote his name down, and heavily underlined it. Sometimes, the quiet ones who don't fit in are the exact ones people start quickly whispering about when things go wrong. But the final, most crucial piece of the puzzle was completely different. Gustavo Herrera was the exact kind of gentleman no one ever suspects of anything. He brought a packed lunch from home every day, quietly prayed before every meal, and always faithfully called his loving wife right after finishing every dangerous transport route. He was way too perfect. Luis had almost completely moved past him, until he secretly saw one tiny line buried deep in his medical report. Chronic anxiety, prescription Zolpidem. He slowly exhaled a long breath and leaned back in his cheap chair. For a very long moment, he just stared blankly at the spinning ceiling fan. Then, he slowly stood up, walked over to the massive wall where all the deadly threads were violently pinned, and stood completely silently in front of it. He wasn't moving, he was just calculating. He slowly lit a cheap cigarette, then another. By the time the hot sun finally rose, he hadn't moved an inch. But deep inside his dark mind, the terrifying story had already perfectly begun. And these innocent men, Carlos, Mario, Fernando, even quiet Gustavo, they were no longer simply his co-workers. They were all disposable chess pieces, and the invisible janitor was completely ready to arrange their violent deaths. You do not need an automatic rifle, and you certainly do not need a team of expensive mercenaries to take down a multi-million-dollar cartel operation. The absolute deadliest weapon you can possibly use against a heavily fortified security system is completely odorless, totally invisible, and perfectly silent. Luis knew that to pull off the ultimate heist, he needed to completely erase his own existence first. He slowly started siphoning tiny amounts of cash from the cartel's inflated janitorial supply invoices. Over several grueling months, he carefully saved exactly 15,000 pesos. He took that bloody money and quietly traveled to a shuttered auto repair shop on the dangerous outskirts of Mexico City. There, in the suffocating darkness, he met a notorious underground ghost known only as El Artista. This man was a true master of black market identity forgery. Luis did not ask any questions, and El Artista did not ask for any explanations. For 15,000 pesos, Luis bought an entirely new life. He was handed a flawlessly forged Mexican passport, a completely valid United States driver's license, and a heavily encrypted flash drive packed with a fully fabricated digital footprint. It contained realistic school records, mundane parking tickets, and a completely boring credit history. The ghost of Luis Alvarez was officially ready to be completely erased from the face of the earth, perfectly replaced by a completely unremarkable businessman named Ricardo Salinas. But a fake identity was completely useless if he could not actually secure the massive bags of cash. He needed a brilliant way to stop a heavily armored cartel truck without firing a single gunshot. The terrifying solution came to him when he coldly remembered the tiny medical note in Gustavo's file about prescription sedatives. If Gustavo was already chemically vulnerable, Luis just needed to carefully put him to sleep. Luis nervously called his younger cousin, who worked as a low-paid veterinary assistant just outside the city of Monterrey. Pretending to write a fictional movie script, Luis casually asked incredibly specific questions about animal surgeries and surgical anesthetics. His cousin, totally unsuspecting, gave him the exact chemical name he desperately needed: isoflurane. It was a highly potent, nearly odorless, and incredibly fast-acting surgical gas. Luis wrote the complicated word down and circled it 3 times in thick red ink. He immediately started showing up unannounced at his cousin's veterinary clinic, falsely offering to help mop their floors for absolutely free. While nobody was looking, he meticulously observed the delicate surgical procedures, secretly taking detailed notes on gas concentrations, and quietly stealing small bottles of the precious chemical. But theoretical knowledge was simply not enough for a heist of this terrifying magnitude. He desperately needed absolutely undeniable proof. Luis rented a completely abandoned, rotting warehouse miles outside of the bustling town. There were no security cameras, no curious neighbors, and absolutely no witnesses. Inside that damp, freezing building, he began conducting his dark, sickening experiments. He did not test the stolen gas on human beings. Not yet. He started his cruel trials with stray rats. He would place them in totally sealed plastic containers, carefully pump in the invisible gas, and coldly monitor exactly how many seconds it took for them to completely lose consciousness. Then he methodically moved on to larger animals, feral cats, stray dogs. It was not genuine science. It was a terrifying, psychopathic rehearsal. Every single time an innocent animal violently collapsed, Luis did not even flinch. He just coldly took more detailed notes, slightly adjusted the chemical concentration, and patiently waited for the animals to wake up. He learned that a mixture of exactly 3% isoflurane, fed directly through a standard vehicle air conditioning system, would completely knock out a fully grown adult male in exactly 90 seconds. Next, he used his self-taught engineering skills to meticulously build a very small, matte black, remote-controlled delivery device. It was no larger than a standard cell phone, designed to perfectly snap onto the plastic air intake valve of a heavy transport truck. He relentlessly tested the terrifying device on rusted-out trucks in a local junkyard, repeatedly tweaking the hidden airflow mechanics and the remote control range, until it was absolutely flawless. By the end of the 3rd exhausting week, the invisible janitor had a fully functioning biological weapon. But securing the massive bags of money was only half of the deadly equation. Moving $6.2 million in physical cash requires extreme precision. That meant no loud helicopters, no heavily armed convoys, and absolutely no high-speed chases. He secretly purchased a completely battered, sun-bleached 1994 Nissan Tsuru. It was the exact kind of pathetic, broken-down car that Border Patrol agents and cartel spotters simply looked completely through, not at. He ruthlessly ripped out the entire back seat, stripped the old license plates, and heavily reinforced the rear suspension system using thick scrap metal. He knew that 12 massive, waterproof duffel bags crammed full of heavy cartel cash would barely fit inside the tiny vehicle. He mapped out an incredibly dangerous, totally unpatrolled smuggler's corridor, winding straight through a thick, fog-covered forest near the Texas border. He walked that grueling 8-kilometer dirt path exactly 24 times in the dead of night, secretly burying tiny directional markers and carefully timing the exact rotation of the Border Patrol surveillance drones. The flawless biological weapon was completely ready. The pathetic getaway car was perfectly hidden. The deeply tragic, highly convincing story framing 4 innocent men was completely written in blood. Now, all the invisible janitor had to do was press start. 3:03 in the morning. The deadly trap was finally set. The heavy, freezing fog was incredibly thick, rolling violently across the pitch-black highway near Campo Nuevo. Luis Alvarez stood completely alone in the blinding darkness, waiting patiently for his massive prey. He was wearing a freshly pressed, highly convincing replica of a cartel security uniform. He had meticulously built a completely fake emergency checkpoint right in the absolute middle of the notorious smuggling route. He had set up 4 cheap red traffic cones, a flashing strobe light mounted on a stolen maintenance truck, and a crudely painted inspection sign. It looked incredibly authentic in the dark, leveraging the cartel driver's deep conditioning to instantly obey random internal security checks. He reached deep into his heavy coat pocket and slowly pulled out the tiny black remote control. He had rewired this stolen diagnostic tool himself, transforming it into a digital weapon. He pressed the single red button. Instantly, miles away in the heavily fortified command center, the live GPS feed on Gustavo's approaching armored truck completely froze. The digital illusion perfectly indicated a routine, unscheduled 6-minute smoke break on the side of the road. No alarms sounded, no red lights flashed. The cartel operators simply ignored the minor delay, completely unaware that their massive fortune was about to brutally vanish. Headlights suddenly cut violently through the heavy mist. The massive armored truck slowly appeared, its heavy brakes squealing loudly as Gustavo obediently stopped right in front of the flashing strobe light. Luis calmly stepped forward out of the thick shadows. He held a fake clipboard in his left hand, projecting absolute, unquestionable authority. He did not shout. He did not wave a weapon. He simply announced a routine security inspection in a cold, practiced voice. Gustavo, completely exhausted and desperately wanting to go home to his loving wife, simply nodded his head. He slowly put the heavy transmission into neutral. Luis smoothly circled to the front of the massive grille, his hands moving with terrifying, mechanical precision. He quickly snapped the matte black chemical delivery device directly onto the primary air conditioning intake valve. He tapped the trigger button hidden inside his coat. The silent countdown began. 90 seconds. That was all it took. The invisible, odorless isoflurane gas flooded violently into the sealed cabin. At 3:05 in the morning, Gustavo violently slumped forward, completely unconscious, his heavy head resting completely dead against the cold steering wheel. Luis moved incredibly fast. He dragged Gustavo's limp, heavy body into the passenger seat, aggressively climbed behind the massive wheel, and quickly drove the stolen truck straight off the main highway and deep into a forgotten, unpaved dirt access road. 10 minutes later, he arrived at a completely abandoned, crumbling farmhouse, completely hidden from the outside world. His battered gray Nissan Suru was already waiting there, perfectly hidden under a thick sheet of rusted metal roofing. The massive trunk was already wide open. The true physical labor of the ultimate heist officially began. Luis mechanically hauled 12 massive, heavy, waterproof duffel bags, completely packed with $6.2 million in pure cash, out of the armored truck, violently throwing them into the tiny Nissan. 8 minutes and 17 seconds. That was the exact time it took to completely drain the cartel of their blood money. But Luis was not finished. He slowly walked back to the stolen truck to meticulously plant his terrifying masterpiece of deadly deception. He carefully placed a forged, handwritten confession letter directly on the passenger seat, perfectly mimicking Mario Guerrero's messy handwriting. He tossed a cheap burner phone onto the floorboards, totally packed with dozens of completely fabricated text messages linking Carlos Vega to offshore bank accounts. He deliberately scattered several business cards, completely covered in Fernando Silva's stolen fingerprints. Finally, he aggressively shoved a fake maintenance checklist into the glove compartment, prominently featuring Ricardo Morales' forged initials. The deadly narrative was now completely flawless. This was not a robbery executed by a single genius. This was a massive, highly coordinated internal betrayal executed by a greedy team of rogue drivers. Then came the absolute final, brutal touch. Luis coldly leaned directly over Gustavo's deeply unconscious body. He pulled his right fist back and violently smashed it directly into Gustavo's sleeping face. The thick nose cartilage cracked incredibly loudly in the silent night. Hot red blood poured heavily down Gustavo's face. Luis violently smeared the fresh blood aggressively across the leather steering wheel, purposefully creating a highly convincing, chaotic crime scene of a violent internal struggle. At 3:16 in the morning, Luis Alvarez completely disappeared into the freezing fog in his tiny gray car, driving completely without headlights. The perfect heist was officially complete. By 6:30 the next morning, the entire cartel operations center had violently erupted into absolute heavily armed chaos. Gustavo had eventually woken up, heavily dazed, completely covered in his own dried blood, with absolutely no memory and no money. The heavily armed internal task force immediately violently descended upon the crime scene. They found the planted phone, the fake fingerprints, the forged confession, and the bloody steering wheel. The paranoid cartel bosses completely swallowed the terrifying lie without a single moment of hesitation. Within exactly 48 hours, the violent death orders were officially issued. Carlos Vega was brutally hunted down and shot dead in an alleyway. Fernando Silva desperately tried to flee to Guatemala with his family, but the cartel brutally executed him, his innocent wife, and his 2 young children. As a terrifying message to all future traitors, Ricardo Morales was violently tortured for 3 agonizing days before finally dying in absolute agony. Mario Guerrero was mercilessly gunned down in a crowded casino. 7 completely innocent people violently died for the janitor's perfect crime. Meanwhile, Luis had successfully crossed the dark, unpatrolled river into southern Texas, burying his fake car and hiding his massive fortune. 6 months later, a completely wealthy, highly respectable businessman named Ricardo Salinas quietly purchased a massive, luxurious home in San Antonio, Texas. His business records were completely spotless. His background was totally clean. He was a complete ghost, successfully living off millions of dollars of perfectly laundered cartel blood money. He had completely beaten the most violent men on earth. But absolute perfection comes with a terrifying, permanent price. Every single night, when Ricardo Salinas closes his eyes in his massive, quiet mansion, he does not dream about his millions of dollars. He violently wakes up in a cold sweat, completely haunted by the terrified, echoing screams of Fernando's innocent young children. The cartel had brutally killed for control, but Luis had ruthlessly killed for absolute silence. And the incredibly dark, horrifying truth is that the greatest criminal mastermind in history is permanently trapped inside a psychological prison of his own brilliant making, forever listening to the violent ghosts of the people he mathematically destroyed. He engineered the perfect escape from poverty, only to discover that you can never truly escape the terrifying monster you had to become to survive.